Thank you, everybody, for coming. So excited to bring this group of filmmakers who've done just an incredible job on this Peabody Award-winning already series. We've got about 30 minutes. I've got questions for all of you, but it also occurred to me while we were watching that the character of Frankie, I just realized something about this character, but I'll get to it later. Yes. That is you, Noah. I want to start with some questions because we've just seen this incredible finale. I would say one of the best finales I've ever seen for a limited series. Seriously. And I want to know, Ron, the idea for the ending at the AIDS Memorial Quilt. When did that come to you, and what was the experience like filming it?
Well, I think fairly early in the process in adapting Thomas Mallon's beautiful book, Fellow Travelers, I knew, which is set exclusively in the 50s, I just knew there was something about the pairing the persecution of homosexuals during the Lavender Scare with what I had lived through, which was the AIDS crisis. And there seemed to be a very obvious parallel there. The government's indifference during the AIDS crisis led to thousands of deaths of gay people. So that was there, and I think very early on, I just saw Hawk at the AIDS quilt looking at Tim's quilt square. So that idea was in my head pretty early, I think, in the process. And the squares that you saw, except for the Tim and the ones that are around Tim's, are actually real, genuine squares from the actual quilt. And actually, there's a section outside that you perhaps saw as you came in. And we were very thrilled when the names Memorial Foundation, when we called to sort of say, we just want to build these, so our own quilt squares, and would you give us the dimensions and tell us how to do it? They said, oh, we'll send you sections of the real quilt, because they wanted to participate in the show. So it's just really moving. And I know how it was for me, and for Matt, to be there and shoot it that day, a rather chilly December day, when we were threatened with rain all day, and for me and Robbie to be able to explain to 200 extras what this was a little sad, because you wish you didn't have to explain what the AIDS quilt was to people, because the AIDS quilt should be very, the AIDS, I think people were forgetting about the AIDS crisis, but it was also a very moving experience.
Matt, what was it like for you? And I'm particularly interested in the line where he says he was the man I loved. It must have been incredibly moving, but it was also, that was the culmination of, your entire performance. I felt like he had found his courage to say it.
No pressure. Thank you, everybody, for being here tonight, first of all. And Jess, thank you for hosting this. You've been such an incredible supporter of the show from the word go, and it means so much to all of us. We love you anyway, but now we really love you.
But even more.
I didn't know that we were going to have the real quilt. It was a really, especially the last episode, it was a really intensive shoot. I think I did 96 out of 100 days of filming on this. And so at the end there, I was just kind of getting shuttled and pushed in the direction of whatever set I was on. And I knew it was a really emotionally intense scene. And then getting there and realizing that we were so fortunate that they had given us a portion of the quilt, it was kind of about getting out of my own way. And what so much of this project was realizing that it was so much bigger than me or any one person involved in it. It was a story that really was bigger than any one of the sum of its parts. And so I just tried to get out of my own way, and let the experience of having the quilt there wash over me. And yeah, thankfully we'd had 8 hours of content, 4 movies basically, that we'd built up to that moment. And Johnny and I had created the history of the characters, and so all the backstory and the homework that you do for a moment like that was a kind of a lived experience already.
The scene in the hospital room where Lucy goes to visit Tim. Allison, I'm so curious what your conversations with Jonathan were like, because you obviously didn't have that many scenes together throughout, and that was so pivotal, especially for your character.
Well, the conversations that Jonathan and I have are not fit for any public consumption. For anyone who's ever interacted with Jonathan, you understand why I'm saying that. He is a hilarious... No, but in all seriousness, in preparation for that scene, we did very little talking about the process or anything. It was kind of like a boxing match. We were in our own little siloed areas, and we would come in to the scene from different parts of the stage. And it was a really intense experience. As you said, we didn't have a lot of scenes together, but we spent so much of the show thinking about each other and in opposition to each other. So to actually have that moment to just sit down and sort of like, okay, here we are. And that scene, there's so many moments in that scene that I just, it felt so vital to get right. And he delivers such an incredibly present, aching, raw performance filled with pathos and resentment and empathy. And he's able to convey all of those things so quickly. It made my job very easy. I mean, he's just superbly talented. But yeah, Lucy had some things to find out, even though she didn't really understand what they were. She found them out.
I feel like we could do an hour about the wardrobe and hair and makeup of this. Yeah. I mean, starting with Hawk's suits. I mean, there's so much, and Frankie's wardrobe. I mean, there's just, the wardrobe really did a lot of heavy lifting. But I feel like my favorite wardrobe moment had to be the white Chanel suit that she wears, because it is this suit of armor in a way. I'm so curious the decision behind that.
Joseph, who is like the incredible Joseph LaCourte, who's the incredible costume designer, just an absolute genius. We, from the beginning, knew that was the direction we wanted to go in. And there was a really odd thing that happened. I don't really know how to say this in a way that, well, whatever. There was a woman, a classy woman who passed while we were filming who was my size. I'm sorry I'm laughing. That's not funny. It's not funny at all. And yet, she had a Chanel purse and she had a Chanel suit. And she entered the world of fellow travelers I don't know how else to talk about this. This is tonally very strange, but that is true. That's the derivation of the suit. And the moment we saw it, and the moment he saw it, even in photos, he was like, that's the one. Because it's classy, but it's structured, and she was ready for two of the hardest conversations of her life.
It was just incredible. Jelani, what do you remember about filming the "You Are Innocent" speech, which is so shattering? Was it shattering for you or just to me?
I think it's shattering to myself, to everyone on the stage, to everyone who hopefully watched it tonight. I think it's the words that a generation were longing to hear, that a generation is longing still to hear. I think it's the words that represent, as we begin Pride Month. Happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride.
I think it's the words we all want to carry in our hearts, that we are products of our environment, and sadly, that taints our innocence, and it puts a stain on it. But love is the cure and the thing that can remove that stain, and we're all worthy of that, and we're all truly innocent.
Robbie, why? I know a little bit about your background. I think every single one of you on this stage, hi Dan, how are you? Every single person on this stage has things in their background that really makes specific things that make this series resonate. What resonated the most about this project for you? Because you were involved really early on, when it was a tough sell.
Well, first I have to say, just to be back on the stage and to be around these people that I love so much is like, it's making me emotional just to think about it. The work we went through, Ron and I, all of us in the writer's room as we start to discuss these things, there's just so much depth to all of it. And, obviously, it being Pride here in Los Angeles, I was trying to go to the grocery store and I was like, bad idea. So my past life, I was a professional soccer player and closeted for many of those years. And not to compare the locker room or the life of a closet professional athlete to the McCarthy era or living with AIDS and the secrecy perhaps of hiding that from your family. I lived in a very extreme closet where I felt like I was living this dream of a professional soccer player, and at any moment I could be outed and ripped out of the locker room, and that this dream of mine would be squashed. And I started playing soccer when I was 5. I remember when I went to the Colombia-U.S. World Cup game made me want to be a professional soccer player. So it was a dream that I always was grasping for. So the idea of, especially when Ron sent me this book, of Hawk and Tim, finding quiet moments to just, have affection, to show love to one another, that at any point someone could, spill a secret where their lives would be ruined. And, obviously that carries on throughout the decades, but I just was so moved by the book and then by Ron's take on it. Working with Ron, it really is true. I remember, in the pitch, he had Hawk at Tim's square, and I remember reading the outline. It's not always that you read a writer's outline and you start crying. And I remember, running to Greg and being like, you have to read this outline. It's so beautiful. So, working with Ron, reading this book, this story, a story that, a lot of people don't know about, that I was learning, obviously. I didn't know what the Lavender Scare was. I was just so moved, and from the second I read it, I called Ron, I said, if you don't do this, I am taking this to Greg and Sarah at Warner Brothers, and we will do it without you. So please say yes, and let's do it. And he was born to write this, to create this, and to have all these people on the stage. Obviously we're missing Johnny and a number of other people that made it possible, but it really, I'm just here and I have the chills just to be back on stage with these people discussing these stories and these characters. So.
Dan, I'm going to ask you this because I don't think it gets talked about that much in episodic television, and no one knows more about that than you do. But this series, first of all, it holds together so well, but it's also deceptively intricate with this, even this episode, the times it goes back and forth in 1957 and 1986. It's also an incredibly complicated editing job. As there were several different directors that worked on it. And what was sort of the North Star for the directors, for them, A, shooting, but also B, talking to the actors? What was helping them do it in such a beautifully consistent way?
Well, I think we had the great guidance of Ron and his incredible scripts that made things very clear. The tone of the piece was incredibly clear. And what was important to me when we set the series was that it was accessible, that it didn't feel like we were making a pastiche of a 1950s film, that these people needed to be emotionally available, they had to be accessible. And so that was always the most important thing. And the other thing that was important to me as we got into it, as we kind of started shooting and as we were preparing and rehearsing, was to find the joy in these people's lives. Because as someone who grew up in the 1980s, I came of age in the 1980s during the height of the AIDS crisis, we still fell in love and went out and fucked and had fun, and it's like we really lived. So I didn't want people to, these are just a young cast and didn't necessarily live through this. You can read about it, but to find the joy of that and the idea that these queer people were always going to find each other, so those things were important to us. And that also that the sex was such an integral part of these characters because it was the thing that was the most dangerous and the most important and linked to the love, that they were pursuing. So, it was always to kind of protect that, but also always to make it move the story forward and always imbue the characters with more, there was always like a dynamic to it. And every one of the sexual relationships were different. So those were the things that we tried to, we kind of prepared a manifesto almost for the piece before we went into it that had a visual component and writing about tone, and then each of the directors brought their own experience and their own sort of flair to it. And so that was really exciting to see, as the cuts came in.
I'm so glad you brought up the sex scenes because there's nothing Matt Bomer likes to talk about more.
Dude, I just thanked you.
You're welcome.
Man.
You're welcome.
In front of all these people.
Should have given me more. I don't mind talking about it at all. I did it for years. I'm very, very wizened.
They are so, it is fascinating though, besides them being sex scenes, so of course that's interesting, but the way they reflect what's going on in that relationship.
Yeah.
And the one that we just saw in this episode says a lot about the power dynamic and the maturity of Tim. And am I right? Is that how you guys saw it, this particular one?
Well, maybe Ron's the right person to speak to that initially, but I think all the scenes were, as Jelani mentioned, we're all a product of our environment, and it was a way for the two characters to not only work out that they were a product of their environment, but how they responded to the environment in an oppressive society. And the way they connected with each other was almost a therapeutic way to navigate that with each other. And so I think it is a big step in this episode, but I think it's sort of an extension of that when Hawk is willing to be a little bit more vulnerable than he's been with Tim in the past.
And there is a practical answer to that as well, which is that in the writer's room, we had certain rules. I'm a guy who lives by rules, for better or for worse. And one of the rules was the sex scenes are always about, all the scenes are negotiations and about power, but especially the sex scenes. But also that every sex scene would be different, and we get toward episode 8, and the writers and I are saying, what haven't we done? Like, what, is there an orifice that hasn't been, we really spent and I oh wait, I know something Hawk hasn't done yet. And there you go. And that was the result.
Okay, I'll stop. I'm going to let Noah rescue you. It occurred to me watching this finale. I've probably seen it 4 times now, but it's a group of cowardly lions all looking for their courage. That's really how I see it now. And Frankie was courageous from the outset. So it's so interesting that in the end, Frankie is the one they all aspired to be. And I'm so curious if you saw Frankie that way. Did you think a lot about Frankie's courage and why he had it?
Yeah, I did. Today being the start of Pride is very interesting that we're having this conversation because, if you do a deep dive into queer history, it's the black and brown queens, drag queens, trans women, lesbians that are responsible for this happening. And so when I took on the character of Frankie, I knew that he represented so many people, in that lineage. Marsha P., Stormy, there's countless names of people whose lives were lost. And so I didn't want to make him a victim in any way. Because stepping out into the world as yourself, a black queer man is a major act of bravery. And so I tried to carry that through, throughout the decades, that just showing up, even if you have to put on some armor, is a beautiful thing. So yeah, it's a beautiful thing to see.
And you look mighty fine doing it, baby. Every decade, you look so good.
Thank you.
Just really quickly, and I know you've all at various times been asked this question, but I want to know favorite decade to shoot and why? Matt?
Oh, Fire Island, no question.
Yeah,
70s.
I figured.
Yeah, not just for the short shorts. It was so nice. We'd been in the repressed, tight fist of the 50s for a few episodes at that point, and it was so nice to just have that bacchanalian freedom of self-expression, even though with Hawk it was sort of masked through a fog of, substance abuse. But it was so nice to just get to celebrate and sort of have that, and not just the group sex, but just, to just let it all hang out a little bit after we've been so repressed and literally buttoned up for so many episodes.
I'm so glad you brought up sex scenes. I'm kidding. Dan, which was most interesting to you?
I think 1980 San Francisco. There's a danger to it and a darkness and also a kind of intensity to it that's intriguing.
It's hard for me to pick because my wigs, I mean, it's like a biopic for, I'm like Prince one day, I'm Michael the next. So how do you pick one decade?
They all have names in
Yeah,
their
they all have
makeup show.
names.
They all have
Lionel
names.
Richie. It's like, how do you pick a decade? But I did love my Eartha Kitt, 50s Santa
Yes!
baby.
Woo!
That one takes the cake.
I have to agree. I think Ron and I, perhaps when we think of what's our favorite decade, we also have nightmares of how do we recreate Fire Island in Toronto. But I remember seeing, obviously on set, but also watching the first dailies and first cuts of Hawk and Tim and Marcus and Frankie in the cozy corner in the 50s. And it was smoky and sexy and just so beautiful. And when you see Stormy singing, it's just all of it. And the little peephole that pops up that was on screen, I was just like, oh my God, I want to be here. I want to experience this. So I think that was my favorite, that was my favorite, even maybe one of my favorite moments. It was really intoxicating.
I think selfishly for me, I love the 80s because I love the transformation work that I got to do and become an older man, that I tried to model my walk off of some people in our creative teams and got yelled at. But
Wait. We'll talk.
I thought it was indelible, but hey, what are you gonna say? And also, I think there's something about Marcus coming to owning himself in the 80s and just being happy in his body and being able to stand up and protest. That I was like, this feels free, and so I really enjoyed that time.
I mean, my favorite, I loved the 60s for Lucy just because she got a little drunk. She had the one sex. Just the one. Just the one. Her
there were two kids.
Her decadely sex. She got a little she was chain smoking. She was eye fucking that guy. She had a little make out. I loved imagining the world where she just followed that and just started on her own path, but instead she put it all back in a turtleneck and went into the 70s. As you do. How about you, Ron?
Well, I in some ways the 70s was the most personal. I came out in 78, and so there's many things about that episode that I took from my life, my own experiences. But I loved the filmmaking of the 50s. And those sets, the hearing room, the cozy corner, those were built by us and designed by Anastasia Massaro, and they are I don't know if episode 5 when we had 6 cameras shooting the Army McCarthy hearings. There was something to watch the crew and all the craftsmen on Fellow Travelers who and Joseph's clothes and the makeup and how these, it was just, I was really impressed and inspired and really moved by what everybody brought to that decade. So, but it's sort of like saying which of your children do you prefer? I love them all equally.
Ron, was there a particular aspect when you first were exposed to this material and began imagining it as a series? What was the most fascinating aspect of it? Was it life in the closet? Was it the lavender scare? There were so many elements to this.
It's funny because people always think I'm like this political guy who wants to make these things have important messages, and that happens by accident. It's in my work. There's something about, and Dan referenced it, that people who find ways to love and have passionate sex and to have joy in their lives when their expression of that was life-threatening, and I had lived through that in the 80s, and there was something about the 50s when simply someone seeing you coming out of an apartment in the morning and reporting you could mean your life would be ruined. You would be marked as a sexual deviant for the rest of your life. You would never teach. You would never work in government again, and it happened to thousands of people. And there's something about, as a storyteller, the high stakes of that, and to put a love story in that, and because I do believe that love is undeniable, and that that people who have risked everything to love each other that was a story I wanted to tell.
Robbie, what was the vibe in the writers' room? Because there was I know Ron was guiding it, but there was so much fiction woven into fact, and the historical details that you all have worked into these scripts is pretty remarkable.
I'm very interested in this answer.
Yeah.
Well, we had most of the writers' room at our house, in just up the street from here. I would say for myself, and I know for my sister and a few of the other writers, it was a real education. It was an education. Ron, I say this a lot, but he's very professorial in the way that he mentors, a lot of us young writers. We had a researcher who had like a giant dossier of the timeline of all the years, what was going on in LGBT history at that time, what was going on in American history. So we had so much information while we were writing. And I would just say, for a lot of us writers to sit back and listen to Ron talk about this story, listen to him talk about the history, was really, I think, an education for us. And any one of those writers on any project would sign up in a second to work with Ron again, because he's just such an incredible writer. It's really, any script, any outline, is really a piece of art. So I felt lucky to be part of it, and we really just had such a great time, actually, and yes, we talked a lot about sex, we talked about history, we talked about structure, we talked about so much. So it was really, I think it's going to be hard for me to find a writer's room ever again that has that much depth and is that unique. It was really, really special.
And Dan, what was it for you personally that made this story resonate with you?
It's interesting because when Ron and Robbie called me in and invited me to work on the series, they sent me the first two scripts. And I was so moved by the first script. And the thing that always stands out to me was the idea of how they described Tim's conflict between his spirituality and his sexuality. And as someone who grew up Catholic, it was really interesting to me to see the sensitivity to how they did it. I'd never seen it done this way before. And that really attracted me to it. And then it was just like this unbelievably rich. I read the first one and I was destroyed, and then I called them before I read the, and then I read the second one. Thank God it was still good. But I got involved right away. So, I'd have to say it was the spirituality, and also I felt like it was something I could really bring something to this, because I came of age in the 1980s, and I really knew what that experience was, to grow up with that feeling of danger and shame, and feeling like, I never expected to live past 30. I probably figured I'll live to be 30 maybe. And, feeling like you were a time bomb. And that was such so depicted so beautifully in the piece. So, yeah, for me it was that.
This is, I guess, probably the last question. I'll start with Matt, but when Jonathan introduced the episode in the beginning, he talked about what he's heard from people who lived in that time, from parents. It just touches so many different generations in different ways. And what have you heard, or one thing that you've heard that really sticks with you from people who've seen it?
I mean, I can't even isolate it down to one. It's just, and I think all of this is just really a testament to Ron's writing and the world he created, and the fact that every single person on the stage, everyone who was a part of this, from costumes to production design, were so personally invested in this story. It was tight at times, it was tough at times, but everybody, no matter how many hours we were working, put their all into it and put their heart and soul into it, because they had some personal connection and investment into the material. And I think the things I've heard from people, it's not what you hear from a typical show or something they respond to. They want to talk about how their uncle was a Hawk, or their cousin was a Tim, or they knew somebody like a Marcus. And it's these deep personal connections they have to the material, where they're able to see their own humanity or someone else's humanity who they knew and loved through the material. And I think as an artist, that's all you can ever really hope for in your work,
Ron Nyswaner, Allison Williams, Jelani Alladin, Robbie Rogers, Noah J. Ricketts, Dan Minahan, Matt Bomer. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.